In this lesson, we're going to start putting some materials onto our volumes so we can render them. So quick amendment from the last lesson. Over here on the instance we were using for our lights, I forgot to put on full point instancing. So just make sure you check that on. And I'll just go ahead and rename this to instance lights so we know what it's doing. So now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to put some materials onto all these volumes. Specifically, we're going to want to put a smoke material on our trails, and explosion pyro material onto our explosions, another smoke material onto our launch smoke, and then a fire material onto our rocket fire. Before we can do any of this though, when we put these materials on there, we want to make sure that they're working, and the only way we can do that is if we can render them. So I'm going to come over to the Alt Network and drop down a new Mantra ROP. I'm going to call this Mantra Interactive. So come over here to our camera, make sure it's set to main cam. Their object, that should all be fine. And their properties, just make sure that output picture is set to IP since we're doing interactive renders. And override camera resolution, just set this to half so you can do your renders a little bit faster since these are just for test renders. And in the same vein, under sampling, I'm just going to come down, and volume quality is already set to 0.25, so that should be fine. I'll just set the shadow quality down as well to get faster renders. When we do our final renders later, we'll want to increase these to 1 and maybe increase our pixel samples as well. But for the test renders, this should work fine. So come back up to our object view. And to get some materials on here, I'm going to come over here to the material palette. Now Houdini comes with some pretty good standard materials that are actually going to work just fine for what we're doing here. So I'm going to scroll down here. And under volume, we have a number of options. One is billowy smoke, which will work pretty well for our trails. So I'm just going to take that and drag it over here to our material palette. You see it shows up there. I'm also going to take this fireball, which is going to work nicely for our explosion. Drag it over here as well. And finally, I'm going to take our flames and drag that over too, so we can put some flames onto our rockets. I'm going to come back over to the object view. And let's go ahead and put our rocket billowy smoke material onto our trails. So I'll click on here, go over to the Material tab. Under Shop, I can select billowy smoke. Now let's see what this looks like. Give us a little bit more room here. And come over to our Render tab. Make sure that Mantra Interactive is selected. I'm going to pause the video and let this render. Alright, that's now done rendering. As you can see here, we properly have our smoke trails with that proper billowy smoke volume. This is looking pretty good. So I'm going to come back over to the scene view. One thing I should mention real quick, when you're going back to the scene view and you're doing these interactive renders, make sure you hit pause or stop on the render, because every time you make a change over here, it's going to try to re-render it. And you don't want that unless you're actually doing interactive render at that moment. So you don't want that always cooking in the background. Come back over to the scene view. And let's put our material onto our fire. I'll just take the trails off for now. So I'm going to scroll us forward a little bit forward so we can also see our explosions as well. But first, let's put our fire material onto our rocket fire. So I come here, select the flames material, and come over to the render view, and I'm going to pause while this renders. As you can see in our render, our fire is showing up on our rocket fire accordingly. Now, Houdini kind of just sticks a base material onto anything that doesn't have a material on it. So we are seeing our explosion and our rocket smoke showing up here, but we're going to want to put our fireball material that we just made onto these so they don't look so opaque and just like looks just like smoke. So again, turn these off. And come over to our explosion under material. Alright, that's opening up off screen. There it is. I'm going to put fireball on here. I'm going to do the same for the launch smoke. Even though we don't have a heat field on here, the settings that come in with the fireball work pretty well for the launch smoke. So we're going to do that. Come back over to render view and pause the video while this renders. And there we go. We are now getting our fireball explosion material onto our actual explosions. And go ahead and turn the trails back on and see what this all looks like together. Again, I'm going to pause the video while this renders. Alright, so let this render for a little bit, and you can see now we have our entire render with all our elements all put together. Now, looking at this, there's probably a few areas of improvement that we can make to this. First off, the noise that we've been adding to our trails might be a little too much. We're also getting some sparseness right off the edge of the rocket here, so we might want to try to fill in a little bit more of this space. And then also back here, it looks like our fade off is not aggressive enough. We're getting a lot of volume buildup. This is partially probably because we're not fading the density enough, and that point jitter that I put on there earlier might be too aggressive. So that's another thing we can change as well. And our explosions aren't too impressive. We might be able to increase the density of these explosions to make them, take up a little bit more space and a little bit more pyroplastic-y. That would look nicer. And then we could also maybe make some changing to our lights to get some better shading on here, get some more contribution from those instance lights, things like that. And of course, if we increase voxel res and we also increase our render resolution, things will look better as well. But let's take some time to make some look dev changes to this to get our trails more in line with what we would want for our final output. So that's how we get materials onto our volumes and render them. In the next lesson, we're going to make a few look dev changes to finalize this effect and set up a mantra render for the final output.